Sue and I are glad to be back for a second week, and we're even more glad that you, the people that came last week, decided to show up again this week, which is always exciting for me that people are willing to come back. Now, Carla told me this week that I just didn't have enough jokes. So I added a couple of jokes just for Carla, and they are really bad this week. So feel free to boo if you want. Who told the most jokes among the colonists? The Pennsylvanians. What if someone goes wrong with the 4th of July celebration at Mount Rushmore? It's a monumental disaster. On Independence Day, what did one firework say to the other? My pop is bigger than your pop. Why are there no knock-knock jokes about America? Because freedom rings. I'll try to do better next week. But I only do this because Carla wants me to. And the Christian Heirs class is just so accustomed to it that they say that we have to have jokes to start with. So anyway, these classes do have a more serious function. Sue and I both agree that a serious discussion about the 4th of July's meaning and the meaning of the Revolution and the Constitution require more than a boxing match on the presidential White House grounds or fireworks around that you might go to. We think it's important for all of us to remember and talk about what it means to be Americans and part of this great nation. Ken Burns likes to say, if you watch any of his documentaries, new ones, he's the guy who did all that Civil War, all those things on PBS over the years. He likes to say that the American Revolution in history was the most important event since the birth of Jesus Christ. Now, that's a pretty powerful statement, I think. So Sue and I working together. She's an economist from the University of Maryland, right?
Western Maryland, or McDaniel.
McDaniel. I was a history major in college and have a master's in history from Vanderbilt. And so together, she corrects me when I get things wrong, and I try to correct her. She's a little more conservative, and I'm a little bit more liberal. But we have actually agreed on most of what we're presenting today. So
except when I'm right.
Except when she's right. So Sue's going to start us off today, and we're ready to go.
You need to stop doing that.
Oh, okay. Yes, ma'am. Already got a conflict.
So today we are going to talk about some of the influences of the New Republic. We're going to talk about religion and the impact of religion in the formation of the Republic. We're also going to talk about one of my favorite subjects, and that's the Enlightenment. So first we're going to talk a little bit about the Revolutionary War and the Republic. So amongst the colonial preachers of the time, there was some preachers that were actually preaching for revolution. Not all, by any means, because many of the preachers were Anglican or more conservative, but there were those who preached a moral justification for the revolution, and they thought that colonial ministers had this righteous cause in front of them, and they wanted to share that with their congregation. So we'll talk a little bit about that. We'll also talk about the clergy as leaders in the Revolutionary War and the chaplains in the Revolutionary War. So there was a fear and some opposition among many denominations. We won't forget them also, because it was a real time of not a civil war, but it could be viewed that way. There were people on each side of the arguments, so there's some of that on each side to be discussed. Okay. So I'm going to talk just real briefly about kind of this period leading up to the Revolutionary War. So there was a belief that civil liberty could only be possible with religious liberty. Many, not all, but many people came to America, came to the colonies in search of religious liberty. They were trying to escape religious persecution. So there was a requirement, or that in their minds, that there be religious liberty in order for there to be true civil liberty. They saw free society as only being able to be free if they had their freedom of conscience, which when they said freedom of conscience, usually they were talking about freedom of religion, my freedom to be able to worship the way I choose to worship. There was a real fear of an imposed hypocrisy. In other words, they thought that the Anglican priests or Anglicans they didn't want to have what's the word I'm looking for? They didn't want to have the leaders of the church imposing their beliefs on them. They thought that the hierarchy of the church was not just the hierarchy of the church, but were also keeping out an eye on the political climate. So they saw them not as just church leaders, but also political leaders. There was also something called the Quebec Act of 1774 that happened in this pre-war period. And that happened when the British said, okay, all you French-speaking folks in Quebec and Canada, we have no problem with you continuing to practice your religion, which happened to be Catholicism. Generally, that sounds like a good idea, right? Well, from the colonists' perspective, they're saying, wait, you are putting a state religion in place. You are saying that you are endorsing a particular religion in one of your colonies, and we don't like that one little bit, because you may be doing that in French-speaking Quebec today, but we know where you're headed next. You're coming down to us. So that was a real source of hardship for them. They also believed that it was a God-ordained new era. There was this idea, mostly rising up out of the Great Awakening, that we talked about last week, hope you remember, that was being increasingly politicized in the 1750s. So there was this whole idea that God has ordained our need for freedom. So predominantly the southern colonies were Anglican. The churches required attendance. They were supported, the leadership of the churches were supported by the tax dollars that were collected as people attended church. So church attendance was required. This also did not sit well. So that's kind of where we were in the pre-war period. So there was this kind of intense anti-Catholic sentiment that had spread throughout many of the colonies. And it's a long-standing anti-Catholic bias. It goes all the way back to the Reformation. It wasn't something that developed here in the colonies. It was kind of this is the way the English have always believed type of a thing. So they viewed Catholicism with a little bit of suspicion, okay, maybe a lot of suspicion. They saw it as being authoritarian. They saw it as being persecuting dissent. If you didn't happen to agree, they felt like you could easily be persecuted. And they feared the power of the Pope, because the Pope was more powerful even than the King of England. So with that fear was also a fear of allegiance to the Pope. So they thought that people who were Catholic had their first allegiance to the Pope, and their country came second. Not something that sat well. So even with this anti-Catholic sentiment, I want you to know that there was only one Catholic who signed the Declaration of Independence. Anybody know? Charles Carroll of Carrollton. He was from Maryland. You can still see his house down in Baltimore City. And do you know why? Well, Maryland was, a free religion state. There were a lot of Catholics in Maryland, at least in portions of Maryland. So that's one possible reason. But the truth of the matter is, Charles Carroll of Carrollton was perhaps the most wealthy man in the colonies. So we don't like any of you Catholic folks except Charles, because Charles has a lot of money and we might need him. So some things never change, even over time. I think you're up.
Okay, just as a side, people were, how many people my age at least remember your grandparents were pretty anti-Catholic as well? Anybody besides me? My grandmother told me that if I went in the attic by myself, the Pope would take me away and make me a Catholic child somewhere. So I was pretty scared of the Catholics for a lot of years. However, I do want to point out that these two gentlemen here that are on your pictures, John Witherspoon was one of the preachers, Presbyterian. He had actually fought as a clergyman back in Scotland when the Jacobite Catholics had a little bit of an uprising. He was the head of a group there. He was a leading Presbyterian minister. He taught James Madison. And King James actually thought that the whole thing in America was a Presbyterian rebellion. If it wasn't for them, Presbyterians would all be okay. All my old Presbyterians, it's your fault. Another guy, Sam Cooper. Sam Cooper was the minister of the Brattle Street Church in Boston. That's where John Adams and Sam Adams and John Hancock regularly worshiped and heard him preach. He was one of the Sons of Liberty that dumped all the tea into the Boston Harbor. I don't think he was one of the mob who went and got into the house of the governor and stole all the furniture and destroyed the house and tried to capture him. But he was called part of the Black Robe regiment, because he was one of those people that was identified in that way. We had chaplains during the Revolutionary War. Washington himself insisted that every regiment have a chaplain. There were 218 that served as chaplains, and 25 of them actually died during the Revolution. That's 11% of the deaths were among the chaplains. These guys, also famous as chaplains. William Emerson, he was one of the first guys to stand up at Concord Bridge, which was the first real battle of the Revolutionary War outside of Boston, when Paul Revere warned everybody they were coming. And Abraham Baldwin, he played a major role in the Constitutional Convention. He was the first one that recommended the Great Compromise that said, okay, let's have equal representation in the upper house and popular representation in the lower house. And then Sam Langdon, he actually preached a sermon to the troops right before the Battle of Bunker Hill. So we had a lot of clergymen that were encouraging revolution, and they actually, one of them went to the presbytery and got them to take away the restriction that said preachers shouldn't talk politics in their sermons, just so they could make points in favor of revolution. This is the guy I like the best. James Caldwell was his name. He was the minister during the Battle of Springfield in New Jersey. And the American Patriots riflemen ran out of the little paper stuff you stuff. Anybody besides Justin ever fired one of those old weapons where you had to have a paper, what's it called?
Paper patch.
A what? Had to put in there in order to fire the rifle. Well, they ran out of the little paper. So James ran into the Presbyterian church and grabbed the hymnals and ripped out all the songs written by the Anglicans and the Methodists and handed them out to the soldiers and said, "Give them Watts, boys, give them Watts." He was rightfully known as the fighting parson. Now, on the other side of things, the Anglican, I missed one, didn't I? Whoops.
I don't think so. I'm up. But you can talk it through.
I was going to say a little bit about the Anglicans who they had to change the Book of Common Prayer, because it said we have to pray for King George. And so they couldn't do that. So they took little paper slots and wrote them over the Book of Common Prayer so you couldn't, so you didn't have to pray for King George. Okay, Sue.
Yep. So that's what this is. This is it happened in the Anglican, in the church, Christ Church in Maryland. The rector actually took those little pieces of paper, and anywhere where we were praying for the king and his wisdom and his safety, we were now praying for our troops. So right there in that middle paragraph, it says, the rector of Christ Church in St. Mary's, Maryland, placed those little pieces of paper over the, and so many churches, the Anglican priests had kind of saw the writing on the wall and started fleeing the country, and many churches started the conversion, thank you, to either non-affiliated or different denominations. So let me find my right page here.
The real turning point, the turning tide, is when Benjamin Franklin over in France got the French to join in to fight the war. Before that time, the French weren't involved. It was a complicated diplomatic process, and once the French got involved, so did their ally Spain. So England was fighting what became a world war all over the Caribbean, all over the eastern part, the western part of Europe, and in the area to the south all the way to the Mediterranean.
So even though the French had become involved, you'll notice that the first picture up here is George Washington. So he was kind of the glue that held the American colonies together. His leadership kept those armies from falling apart when there was poor supplies. His direction, his appointing of those I'm like not with it today.
Okay.
He appointed the people that he needed at the time to be able to guide the troops. So it was really his leadership that kept it all going in the right direction. The French came in and with money and ships and saved the day at the end, but it was Washington who led us through. So at the end of the war, there was what they called Evacuation Day. So the tide had turned, the U.S. had won, the Battle of Yorktown had been won. There was extensive negotiations over the next 2 years about how to put together a treaty between the two countries. And in November of 1783, they left. It was called Evacuation Day. This picture shows a I forget the guy's name, at the top of a flagpole. He was putting up the new American flag on Evacuation Day. But I want you to notice the painting on the far right. It's unfinished. So this is a painting of the signing of the Treaty of Paris. That's the treaty that ended the official war, the negotiated treaty. So it's unfinished because the British refused to sit for their portraits. It's only showing the Americans up there if you look. You can see Washington, you can see Franklin, you can see Adams, you can see a bunch of them, but there's no British in that picture. Part of it was because they were embarrassed. They were not happy that the, most capable fighting force in the world had lost to these rebels. There was also apparently one negotiator, a man named Richard Oswald, who was outstandingly ugly, according to the portrait painter, and he would refuse to sit for the portraits. So they all said, well, if Richard's not going to, I'm not either. So I found that amusing. But this is still considered a symbol of the tensions between the two countries at the time. So you can see this portrait. It's actually in Winterthur Museum up in Delaware. It's just over the line near as you go up 95 into Delaware at the Winterthur Museum. It's really an interesting place. They have great gardens too. So you can go and tour the house, the colonial house, see the gardens, and also see many of these artifacts and paintings. Okay, so a nation is formed. Between 1783 and 1800, there were many challenges that the nation faced as it tried to kind of get its act together, if you will. It initially started out operating under the Articles of Confederation. Do you guys know much about that? Because it didn't work, that's why. But during this time, does anybody here know who the our first president was?
Hanson?
Yep, a guy named John Hanson. He actually was born in Charles City in Port Tobacco, down in the southern part of Maryland, but moved up here to Frederick. He was a great administrator. He had been sheriff, he had been clerk of the court and a judge, and he was Maryland was the last colony to actually sign the Articles of Confederation. And so it was upon that signing that it went into place. And John Hanson was chosen to be the first president of the Confederation. So it was not quite the way we think of presidents. It was more a ceremonial role, an administrative role. It was not an executive role like the Constitution eventually put in place, but many people refer to him as the first president of our United States. You can see a statue in front of the courthouse in Frederick, Maryland. It's worth nobody knows who he is. He's just kind of standing there in bronze. It's worth a trip to walk up and take a look at him. So the reason why the Articles of Confederation didn't work, they were exceedingly weak. The colonists were very suspicious of a strong central power. So there was no executive branch at the time. John Hanson was pretty much it. There was a weak central government. The states had all the power. Anything the Congress had to say to the states were more like suggestions. Well, you can imagine the states really were looking out for their best interest, and those suggestions could just be quickly overlooked. So the states acted more like independent countries than they did a United States, if you will. But underlying all of this, there were financial needs that needed to be serviced. So there were also changes in the religious community.
Okay, during the period of time, we had the people moving west because we had access to move over the mountains. Remember from last week, the British had said, you can't go over the mountains because you're going to start war with the Indians again. And so they wouldn't let people, and we wanted to go west, but we also had all these large families coming along in the church. Remember, there's a lot of arguments going on between the old lights and the new lights. The old lights were the dogma, strict liturgy kind of faith. The new lights were the emotional experience kind of faith. We talked about the Great Awakening last week. And so you can imagine the kind of conflict. If you can't, just think of what it was like when this congregation, those of you around, in 1997, when the church was debating whether we should have drums and guitars in the sanctuary or not. It was quite a conflict between sides. It said, "Welcome, Fred. Glad to have you as our minister." They also had to get over the fact that they didn't have a king that was going to tell them what to do. So we're talking about today, pretty much, this period of time between after the Constitution was formed and when the nation was just being developed. During this time, the Baptist Church had rapid growth. Who wants to tell me why the Baptists would be growing a lot during this time? I know we got some historians in this group. Why would the Baptists, of all people, the Baptists, which hadn't been much of a church, Roger Williams started them back in Rhode Island, and soul freedom and the notion of that and congregational autonomy. But why would that happen? Why would they grow? Aside from being right about baptism, why would they grow? What? They became the church in the West and the South. The South has more Baptist churches than anybody else. Anybody being South to know that?
Fred,
Yes.
What?
What?
Circuit riders?
Nope, that's the Methodists. They come next. Well, think about the Baptists. What's your faith built on? Your individual relationship with God, right? In your dogmatic church, your old-fashioned way of doing things, your relationship was built around the community that gathered for worship together. It was a community experience. The Baptists were, and how did that fit with American democracy? We were very much involved in the idea that everybody is equal and we can all have a voice and we have our individual religion. So that was one of the things that was causing their growth. The other was that they practiced revivalism extensive. So they went out and worked hard to try and get more people to come to the church. Now the next group is the Methodists. Who's been a Methodist sometime in their life? Ah, yes. How do you get your preacher in the Methodist church? Dennis will tell us. How do you get your minister?
We're appointed.
Yes.
We're not called.
Yeah, you don't have much choice in the matter. The bishop says, "Okay, Dennis, you're going to go over here." In the older days, it was when I started out in ministry. There's a whole bunch of changes at the end of June, and you'd go to annual conference, and you didn't know whether you're going to move or not.
Well, earlier it wasn't June. They changed that because of school schedules.
But the Methodists grew despite that fact because they developed this neat system called the circuit rider. The circuit rider was a minister who was set out, whose point was to start new churches and to minister to them. What did you used to say about the Methodist Church, Sue?
Every time the circuit rider stopped for lunch, they established a church.
If you didn't hear, every time the circuit rider stopped for lunch, he established a church. And that's kind of how they grew. Plus the fact they had this hierarchy that said, you don't get to be called and work in a congregation as whenever you want, stay as long as you want. I'm going to tell you where you go on the basis of what the needs are. And so the bishop was able to say, go there. So they had this circle of hierarchy.
Oh, the Episcopal system.
It's called the Episcopal system, that's right.
The Anglican and the Episcopal.
And they had a little bit of a problem at first because they didn't have any bishops. Because what happened to them? 3/4 of them went back to England because they were Tories. What happened to all the members of the Anglican Church? 50,000 of them went to Canada. So half of the Methodist churches did exist at the end of the Revolution. Half of them didn't have ministers. And they didn't have a bishop who could appoint a new minister. Because remember, how do you get to be a minister in the Methodist Church? You are ordained. And what does that mean for a Methodist and a Church of England person? It means you stand in the line of succession. In other words, somebody touched your head that touched the head of the person before you, until Peter touched Jesus. Jesus touched Peter and made him the first church. So we have continuous line with the touch of the person. What happens when you don't have any bishops?
No succession.
You can't have any clergy. So how'd they get around it? Parliament finally, in 1786, said, okay, we'll give you a bishop. How'd they get around it? They sent someone from Scotland to appoint 2 bishops. Any former Methodists know who we're talking about? Francis Asbury. That's why so many churches are called Asbury Methodist Church.
And the college in Tennessee.
And a college in Tennessee. And
I have, I have one of those useless facts. My brain's full of these useless facts. But around the time of the Revolution, it was estimated that there was between 20 and 25 Methodist churches in the colony. By the time we reached 1800, 19,000. They established a church every time they took lunch. Yeah, Carolyn.
Important place for the Methodists in the colonies at this point in time was Baltimore City.
okay,
They had big conferences in Baltimore City. There's a church in Baltimore City, Lovely Lane, and
they have a very interesting museum there.
yeah.
I also have to remember that Francis Asbury was ordained by a Church of the Brethren, or United Brethren in Christ, friend of Philip William Otterbein, whose church is still working in Baltimore City near the Inner Harbor. Longest operating.
And that's why some of your churches are called Otterbein United Methodist Church. Who's the other first bishop? Thomas Coke. Cokesbury. Coke is named after that first bishop. That's why you have the Methodist Publishing House, for those of you who have some interest in that. So anyway, that's the background of the Methodists. Now the Episcopals, as you can imagine, had a tougher time. So what's the first thing you would do if you were an Anglican church and called the Church of England?
Change your name.
You'd change your name, right. So they got together and they decided that they would then be called the Protestant Episcopal Church. So that's how you got the Episcopalians. They're the folks that are downtown, St. John's, okay? I guess you already know that, and the leader of that change was a guy by the name of Samuel Seabury. The Presbyterians, they didn't have as much trouble because they were all pretty independent, but they already had a nice organization. Unlike the Baptists, they had a nice organization. It was called synods. And the synods had presbyteries, and the presbyteries had the power. The presbytery was the one that said you could be a minister, you couldn't be a minister, you had to have these doctrinal standards, and they fought over the doctrines all the time. That's where cedar and antecedar, for you disciples that know your history, Covenanters and anti-Covenanters, that all comes from Scotland, the Presbyterians. But they had an easier time of it because they were able to do that. The leader of that operation was the same guy we started with, John Witherspoon. He was the chairman. They adopted the Westminster Confession. How many old Presbyterians do we have? A few of you? Yep.
Former Presbyterians.
Former
Not
Presbyterians.
old.
Well, yeah, you don't have to be old to be a Presbyterian. Although it helps. So,
Oh. All right. So this is my thing. I firmly believe, I really believe that without this period of time called the Enlightenment, our country could not have happened, could not have been established the way it has been established. So what is the Enlightenment? It's an intellectual movement that emphasized reason, individualism and liberty, empirical inquiry, and a skepticism for authority. This really impacted the way people thought about their world, thought about nature, their society, and their government. So let's take a look at it. So where are they coming from? Well, this is one of those great periods in time. I mean, during the Middle Ages, everything you did was governed by the Roman Catholic Church. All your daily activities, everything you did was revolved around the Catholic Church. Then they moved into a period called the Renaissance. And that was a time that was characterized by a kind of a rediscovery of primarily in philosophy and literature and the achievements of thinking artistic classes. From there, we moved into the Enlightenment. So the Enlightenment actually emphasized rational thought and reason and science. But without this period of time, our nation could not have been possible. It was a relatively short period of time, happened in 1640-ish, it started, and kind of petered out by 1790. That's only 150 years. But in that, in the grand scheme of the history of the world, that's not very long. And without that little period of time, none of this would have been possible here in our country. They used reason to understand their world, to improve their own conditions. They were in search of knowledge and freedom, progress, and primarily one of their big things they were focusing on was happiness, or what in colonial days would have been called felicity, because they believed that the individual would always strive toward felicity. So the Enlightenment eventually kind of expired of its own excesses. The folks who were preaching Enlightenment took it to the extreme, and that then resulted in other people saying, wait, let's take a look at some of the most important things in our life, and they became focused on what would be called Romanticism. So if you were doing this little chart of where did they come from, the next step would be the Romantic era. So I picked out just a couple of folks to look at for the Enlightenment, a couple of things that show us what they were thinking about. The first one up there is the Bible. They didn't have the internet or televisions, radios. All what they thought about, what they were thinking about was reflected in what they read. So the Bible was the most widely read piece of literature in the colonies, in the world. So I saw something that said of a person who scanned the political literature of the day. The most often quoted aspect in the political literature was the Bible. In fact, it was Deuteronomy. So every household had a Bible, even if they had no other books or had access to a Bible. And the next person I picked was René Descartes, primarily because he was kind of the beginning of it. There's lots of other people in this kind of little group of men. It could have been Rousseau, it could have been many others, but Descartes was the beginning of it. He wrote something called Discourse. I'm sorry, I was a French major too, along with economics. I have to try not to say these things in French. Discourse on method. And he began that whole thought process of how do we think these things through? What is the rational way to look at our life and our world? He's the person who said, Je pense donc je suis, which means I think, therefore I am. This was revolutionary to people. You know, the idea that you could, of your own volition, think on your own and therefore be seen as a sentient human being instead of being, you know, destined by God. That was a whole new idea. I picked Isaac Newton because he did the mathematical principles and natural philosophy. We would have called that physics today. But he was the father of modern science. There are other scientists out there that we could talk about, but I just chose Isaac Newton as our representative person. But one of the most influential people of the Enlightenment era was John Locke. You'll see him referred to many times in the literature. He wrote something called Letters Concerning Toleration, and it was an introduction to religion as an individual and voluntary matter. So in other words, you have no right to tell me how I can worship. It's an individual choice of my own. He also wrote 2 treatises on government, which talks about the consent of the governed. So I have a right to revolt against tyranny because you have to have my consent in order to govern me. But one of the, let's say, most influential people in our national government is a man called Baron de Montesquieu, or Montesquieu?
Montesquieu.
Okay. Who brought many principles that we understand today as part of our Constitution, primarily the separation of powers. He actually identified those 3 branches of government, the legislative, executive, and judicial. He brought many of the checks and balances that we understand and take for granted today into the picture. And he believed strongly in liberty through structure. In other words, you have to have a structure that supports a law-abiding citizenry in order to make this work. Okay, so inevitably, this whole idea of rational thought made its way into religion. So the religious school of thought, it's not a religion itself, but the religious school of thought is called deism. And inevitably, these rational, enlightened people started applying their thought processes to this school of thought called deism, and it could be, and was, conflicting with Christianity often. Deists believed in a non-intervening God. In other words, there was a creator who started all of this, set it in motion, kind of kicked it off, and then stood back to see how this experiment turned out. So their thought is that God no longer governed us, made daily decisions for us, that we were able to think these things through on our own, but that there was a creating God. Interestingly, I found this interesting. This tended to be a belief amongst the men out there in colonial America. I mean, Dolly Madison and Abigail Adams may have been exceptions, but the daughters of Thomas Jefferson were very much traditional Christians. They didn't believe in deism. Martha Washington was very much a traditional Christian. She didn't believe in deism. And there were others, Monroe's wife, Monroe's family. Many of them didn't subscribe to the deistic way of thinking. So when you're looking at these individuals, as we go through them in the future, I want you to keep this in mind. Happy wife, happy life.
I would add to that what your decision-making process here is, how do you make your decisions? By your reason or by revelation? Today I suspect that there are more rationalists in the room than there are people that look at Revelation and say, this is what God said. And if it conflicts with reason, so you're talking about reason with deism and enlightenment, and with Christian faith, you're talking more about accepting that which God has revealed.
So I told Fred this morning that I kept thinking there's something that I've left out. There's something, a point I wanted to make, and so I've added this, and Fred has not seen it before. I don't want you to think that deism totally took over. I mean, these men were raised in Christian homes, usually. The whole society has a kind of Christian foundation, but there is kind of a melding of Christianity and this inner enlightened thinking that happened. So prior to Christianity, if you will, I'm talking way back, Bible times, all religion was political. Where you were born determined who your leader was and who your God was. So you look to your towns, your tribes, your cities' gods to tell you how to behave and what to do and what they demanded of you. And that's how you learned to be a good citizen, by satisfying your gods. So if you were born, I'm not talking about the Eastern religions, not China, but in the Western society, if you were born in a town and their god was one particular god, that was your god too. And when you went to war with the town next door, you were fighting against their god, because obviously that was a false god. It wasn't your god, it was a false god, because you had the true God on your side. So all laws came down from your God. All laws were divine laws. Christianity was the first, and probably at least the most notable, if not the first, religion that made the distinction between civil authority and spiritual authority. So it wasn't until Constantine that Christianity became more widespread across the nations. So at this point, you could have a civil leader and also a spiritual leader. Well, what are you going to do when your spiritual leader and your civil leader don't agree? This becomes a problem. You don't know who to follow anymore. Well, it's the first non-political religion, if you will, because it's a choice that you make. Your faith is a choice that you make. And your religion does not demand that you be born under this particular God or that you're following this particular rule. So now what are you going to do? Well, what our founders did was actually a stroke of genius. They came up with the idea of the laws of God and nature's God. So they kind of took the whole, are you Christian? Are you Jewish? Out of the entire argument. Now they're saying rationally, if there's one creator and you're following that creator's laws, then we're all following the same laws. This became a problem for the European states who had divine rule of kings, because that's how they solved the problem. God has appointed me as your ruler. What I say becomes law because that's my divine rule. Well, the rationalists are saying, nope, that's not true anymore. I mean, there are many instances where you see a divine ruler, divine law, rule of kings that didn't work out. So this is how they got around it, by melding their basic beliefs in Christianity, their rational thinking, and what they did was form a new nation based on that. This is largely information on how the American Constitution used the rational laws. They're based on Montesquieu's beliefs, his 3 branches, checks and balances. We talked about that pretty much already.
And we're going to talk about it some more.
We'll talk about it again.
We'll
So,
start by,
is this
you
you or
done?
me?
oh, I think
Click the
this
next
is,
one.
okay, yes.
One more. Okay. So the character of the citizenry becomes critical to the founding of the country, You have to have an informed and educated citizenry, because if you're going to be making rational decisions, you have to know how to think rationally. Education becomes central. You have to be virtuous. You can't have people out there who are like just going their own way willy-nilly. You have to be thinking in terms of the greater good. And religion, they believed, was the best way to inculcate this into society. So even though they may have been deists, some of our founding fathers, saying this is not what we want to follow, we want to be rational thinkers, they recognized that religion was instrumental to putting our nation in practice. I have a suggestion.
Yes.
Why don't you all stand up, take a stretch, and then Fred will take over. Just a chance to stand up, walk around your chair, move, and we won't be much longer. Yeah. Yeah, I saw you nodding off out there.
Okay, sit down. We only have 9 minutes left. What's the longest word? The longest word in the English language? Who knows? What? Ah, go away. Not it. That's it. A little louder.
I can't say it a second.
Anti-disestablishmentarianism. What does it mean?
I don't know, David, what does
I
it
don't
mean?
know.
Sue can spell it, would you believe? It means that the establishment of a church is not the decision of the state. And the state can't use your taxes to support the church. So we have this notion that came from that we're, because in England the church was established. In 8 of the 13 colonies, the church was established. Your taxes went to pay the preacher.
You want to use the mic, Fred?
So they have a series of enlightened concepts in the scripture, and one of them is the freedom of religion, because it comes out of that notion that the king or the government doesn't tell you what your faith can be. So one of those things is a balance of power. Sue already mentioned it. And that's, I got a lawyer in the back, Judge, to tell me when I get off track, okay? The balance of power is the notion, from my theological perspective, of the depravity of people. In other words, we all fall short of being good all the time. Now, I know a few of you are good all the time, right? Put your hand. Oh, there are two of you in this whole group. I'm really impressed with the people that are good all the time, because I fall short all the time. And what do we want? We want to have power. We want to be in charge. We want to be able to say what things are going to happen. And so what happened in the United States Constitution was we have to figure out a way to control that depravity, that desire for power. Well, it often is when a dictator, an authoritarian, takes over the government and makes all the decisions, and they are in power. So we worry about that, right? And so we developed a system that said we're going to try and balance that out. And our balance is going to be one group that makes the laws, Congress. One person who enforces the law, that's the president. And one small group of lawyers who take care of what the law means for the future. Now, that's Congress, President, Supreme Court. Congress passed what's happened in the past. What do we have to have as a law? Executive, how we should put that into practice. Supreme Court, what should be done in the future. Well, obviously, we have a lot of difficulty making that work, but that's one of the things that's going on these days, is trying to figure out how to keep that balance to work. Some of you would say, you know, Congress isn't doing their job. They just agree with the president. Some of you would say Congress isn't doing their job. They are not disagreeing with the president. Yes.
Who came up with the idea that the president would support, would tell who was going to be on the Supreme Court?
That's in the Constitution. So,
But why did they think that would work?
because there's a period of time when different presidents are in office, and so you'd get a balance of people appointing who would be on the Supreme Court.
So, and
Now, we've had a lot of arguments over the years. Franklin Delano Roosevelt, Supreme Court wouldn't let him get away with some things he wanted to do. So he came up with an idea. He said, let's add 7 more justices so we have 15 justices of the Supreme Court. Well, that didn't fly. People said no, wouldn't let that happen.
It just seemed to me like if you have Republicans and they're in a position of authority for, let's say, 4 or 5 terms, eventually that Supreme Court is going to favor the Republicans.
Well, that kind of did happen before the Civil War. We had a series of Republicans who were very supportive of the southern states and slavery. Then we got a president who wasn't, and all hell broke loose.
it is one of those checks and balances. So the president doesn't decide who's going to be on the Supreme Court. Rather, the president nominates,
And
and then the Congress,
the Senate particularly.
the Senate then approves or disapproves. So it's one of those many checks and balances, and there are checks and balances on the checks and balances too. So the check and balance on that process is your voting. How you vote determines what the makeup of that Senate.
Now, of course, in the early days of the Republic, George Washington and the boys, they thought that having political parties was a bad idea. They didn't want political parties at all. And George Washington thought, the president shouldn't be president forever. He actually gave up power twice. Once as commander of the army after the Revolutionary War, right up in Annapolis, he turned in his sword and said, okay, you guys are in charge again. And then after his second term, he said, no, I will not run again. So, and we kept that until Franklin Roosevelt came along and said, no, I'm going to keep running.
As far as the president appointing chief justices, look into Eisenhower. He appointed Earl Warren, and he said it was the biggest mistake of his life.
Well,
We all make.
got the lawyer here in the back. Do judges always do what the person that appointed them tell them they ought to do?
Always, Fred.
Well, once you're appointed as a judge, it's a lifetime deal until you resign. And so that's supposed to be protecting you of influences by the populace. They were very much afraid of a demagogue, that some political crazy leader would take over, and they're very concerned about that. Y'all said, right, this is one of the hearts of the thing, right?
Right.
Religious freedom. You want, as Roger Williams said, soul freedom. You decide where to go to church, what you believe. The government doesn't tell you. Do we still fight about that?
Yes.
We sure do, because what does that mean? We disestablish the church, right? But should the church be able to support religious schools or not? I mean, the governments. Should the government be able to put the Ten Commandments in every courtroom? So we're still fighting about that. You say, well, we don't, that, if we just went back to the 50s, we wouldn't have these problems. Wrong, because we still have remnants of the government having a say in religion. Anybody, who's a trustee here? Do I have any trustees? No trustees. Tell us, James, how much property tax do we pay as First Christian Church? Zero. That's a big thing. Ministers, we have this little tax dodge. What's it called?
Housing allowance.
A housing allowance. We don't have to pay taxes on our housing. Is that government? This is not a settled issue, and it relates to religious freedom. And it also relates to this next idea that comes out of the Enlightenment and this, and you can interrupt me when you're ready.
Okay.
That we have a separation of the church and the state. Is that in the Constitution? How many people think it's in the Constitution? Oh, you're hesitant. How many people think it's not in the Constitution? How many people know? That's not in the Constitution. The idea is certainly there, but it's the metaphor is not. Thomas Jefferson came up with that. First time he used it was when he wrote a letter to the Danbury Baptist Association. He said, in our government, there's this separation between the church and state. And we still argue about that, right? And one of the interesting facts about this, and Sue's ready to come in on this one, and that is that John Adams came along and negotiated a treaty with what we call the Barbary Pirates. And what do you think? They're down in the Mediterranean. And what do you think their religion was? Christian? What's their religion today? Muslim. That's right. Somebody got it right. So we negotiated this treaty with them because they were stopping all the Christian nations' troops, the ships. They were kind of like the Straits of Hormuz. You had to pay to get through. And Jefferson, Adams said, no, you don't, because what? We are not a Christian nation. He said, that's his words. We are not a Christian nation.
Sorry, Fred.
No, you didn't really knock me over.
Really. So, here's some interesting perspective on that. You know, we had lost the protection of the British Navy. Our ships were no longer being given free passage, and we didn't have anybody to turn to. We did not have a navy of our own that would in any way prevent these Barbary pirates from taking our ships and taking our goods out of those ships. So the only thing we could do would be to negotiate this treaty of peace and friendship, as they called it. Well, this portion where John Adams actually said, as the government of the United States is not in any way a Christian nation, is called Article 11 of that treaty. Here's an interesting fact. I tried to get Fred to take this slide out because I think it's wildly out of context. But here's an interesting fact. Article 11 does not appear in the Arabic translation that the Muslim people were reading. It's not there. It's there solely for English-speaking and perhaps French-speaking people who understood English well. It's there for diplomatic purposes. It's for reassurance of other nations. It's there to point out that the U.S. is not a religiously founded nation. Christian or otherwise, that it's really based on these rules, the Enlightenment theory. It's there. The treaty did not end the problems. Not only did it not appear in the Arabic, it didn't appear in their ethos either. They did not stop. It wasn't until Jefferson that came along that the pirates stopped attacking our ships and taking over. So this is really a commitment to freedom of conscience. It's really a commitment saying, this statement is a commitment saying, we believe in freedom of religion, whether you're a Muslim or whether you're Christian or whoever. We believe that you need to practice your conscience, not whatever we say is the proper way to address your business.
Adam says it, I believe it, that settles it.
Nope.
Raises the question, are we a Christian nation? I had this little slide that I found, not mine, where Thomas Jefferson says, Christianity is nor ever has been a part of the common law. I don't know, is that true or not? A lawyer could tell us, I guess. Christianity is the most perverted system that ever man devised. Then you got Adams, who had that thing that you just said. Thomas Paine, he wrote Common Sense, why the revolution worked. And James Madison, he said the separation of church and state is absolutely essential to the government of the United States. So there's that slide. Sue saw it at first and said,
Take it out.
I hate it.
I hate it. I wrote in big red letters, I hate it. So, on the other hand, John Adams, the first person quoted, also said, our Constitution was made only for a moral and religious people. It's wholly inadequate and unsuited to government of any other kind. Charles Carroll of Carrollton said, without morals, a republic cannot subsist for any length of time. Noah Webster, you know the guy, you know the Noah Webster, the dictionary. He said Christian religion in its purity is the basis, or rather the source, of all genuine freedom in government. So I am persuaded that no civil government or of a republican form can exist or be durable without the principles of religion. And finally, John Jay, who we'll talk more about, said no human society has ever been able to maintain both order and freedom, both a cohesiveness and liberty apart from the moral precepts of the Christian religion. So you give me four who say it's not Christian, I counter you.
On the other hand, it doesn't say Christian in the Constitution at all, period. Now, it does say something about God in the Declaration of Independence 4 times. It also says all men are created equal, self-evident. I don't know about you, but I don't think that's self-evident at all. But when a lawyer stands up and says something self-evident, it's a good way to imply that it is self-evident without having to prove it. But we had all through the early years prayers of prayer and fasting. We had Washington ordered days of fasting and prayer. And Hancock very much were Christian people. So we have some other quotes that we could look up, but we'll just say to you, we debated about this and we have agreed on this statement.
Heavily edited.
But we agreed, right?
We did.
We agreed, if you look here, that there are extremists on both sides of this argument. There are those that say that the founding fathers were all faithful Christian people. Then there are those and other people who say, no, they were all against religion. They were all Enlightenment people. They thought reason is the only basis which you can say anything. There's no basis for things of faith. So we would suggest to you, that, and historians have tended to come to this agreement, The founding fathers were part of a culture influenced by both Christian faith and Enlightenment views. Both. They put them together. They were, in that one slide Sue had, it showed that there was both going on in their minds. And I would suggest to you that there's both going on in your minds too. There's faith and there's reason, and you keep trying to figure out, for me, how do they go together? What works for me? Amen? Anything?
Yep.